Сегодня у нас 27 число, часов яр, забираем 3 людей, 2 собак. Ну такое, тут с каждым днем в самом населенном пункте все труднее и труднее все. Город просто постоянно обстреливают, со всего причем, начиная от градов, заканчивая минометами и всем остальным. Такие вот дела. Ёбаный в рот! Блять, давай! Сука, пидорас!
So if some of you are wondering why I'm doing back-to-back videos, it's because, admittedly, I'm still a bit sour about YouTube removing my last video, which was about the Iranian retaliation missile attack against Israel. And I knew it when I was posting it. I knew it deep down inside that that video was at risk of being censored by YouTube because it was telling a different narrative from what the Western media was saying about the missile attack, which, by the way, is based 100% on sources and authorities from the IDF only. And this is the same tactic they used in the Ukraine war, when Russia also launched their missile campaign toward the end of 2022 and 2023. They relied solely on Ukrainian reports from their military, which also claimed these ridiculous success rates or interception rates of the missiles. So the IDF said they shot down 90 to 99% of the missiles and drones that Iran had fired. And by the way, in Russia, in Ukraine, when they said the same thing, we all looked on the news and said, well, how could 30 to 50% of Ukraine's electrical infrastructure be destroyed, yet you shot down most of the missiles and drones? So if you use that precedent and implant it to Israel, it's obvious that that claim is bogus. And I showed various footages of missiles striking various areas of Israel. But we're not going to hear that, and I'm not going to get into it anymore because I don't want this video to also be taken down. In any event, I am still clueless as to what aspect of the esteemed YouTube community guidelines my video violated. It's simply a form of censorship, as they don't want anything contradicting the Western narrative, especially about Israel war, because Israel is more important to them than Ukraine. This is an existential threat to America and the West if Israel is defeated. As Robert Kennedy, the former Democratic candidate, said, that if Israel is lost, Russia and China will have full control of the Middle East, which amounts to somewhere between 80 to 90% of the world's oil production, and it would be cataclysmic for America's security interests.
Israel is critical, and the reason it's critical is because it's a bulwark for us in the Mideast. It's almost like having an aircraft carrier in the Mideast. It's our oldest ally. It's been our ally for 75 years. It has been an incredible ally for us in terms of the technology, the exchange. And, in building the Iron Dome, which we paid a lot for, has also taught us enormously about how to defend ourselves at home from missiles. So those military expenditures are all going, 75% of it goes to U.S. companies under the agreement, under the MOU. But if you look at what's happening in the Mideast now, Iran is now the closest allies of Iran are Russia and China. Iran also controls all of Venezuela's oil. Hezbollah is in Venezuela. They have propped up the Maduro regime, and so they control that oil supply. BRICS, Saudi Arabia is now joining BRICS, so those countries will control 90% of the oil in the world. If Israel disappears, the vacuum in the Mideast, which is, Israel is our ambassador, it's our presence, our beachhead in the Mideast, and it gives us ears and eyes in the Mideast. It gives us intelligence, it gives us the capacity to influence affairs in the Mideast. If Israel disappeared, Russia and China would be controlling the Mideast, and they control 90% of the world's oil supply, and that would be cataclysmic for U.S. national security. So that
is why the censorship is so high about this Israel-Hamas Iranian war. And that video I made was ranked 1 out of 10 in my last 10 videos. So it is a bit frustrating to see all that work and success completely eliminated for no apparent reason. But I'm going to stop there, and let's get into today's video as I revert back to my coverage of Ukraine. So yes, back to Ukraine, that forgotten about war. And to be honest, there has been very little to talk about since the fall of Avdiivka. That's not because nothing was happening, but it's because it was just so one-sided. For the last few weeks, we've just seen the Russian army advancing slowly and methodically in the Donetsk region, taking village after village. And on the flip side, we simply keep hearing the Ukrainians complaining and whining to the West about the lack of ammunition and lack of manpower, and even going so far as to, it seems, threaten the West that they will give up more territory if the West doesn't come to their aid and replenish their stocks.
I will give you one example, a very simple example. The Trypilska power plant. Electricity in the Kyiv region depends on it. 11 missiles were headed towards it. The first 7 we took down. 4 destroyed Trypilska. Why? Because we had 0 missiles. We ran out of all missiles.
Which, of course, is something the West is simply not able to do, especially when they're fighting a much bigger war in Israel. So, in my opinion, it's like, dude, just surrender. It's over. Why send more of your men to their death? The West is not coming to save you. America is done with Ukraine. The writing is on the wall. And Ukraine is simply not that important anymore. America has bigger fish to fry in Israel, where, by the way, they are soon going to run into the same problem as Ukraine, when they keep spending $1.3 billion to defend Iran's missile attack, when Iran and its allies of the Axis of Resistance has spent less than $100 million launching 30-year-old missiles and drones. Okay, so no more talk about the Israel war. Let's stick to Ukraine. So today I'm going to focus on 2 articles that I think are sufficient to bring us up to speed on what's happening in Ukraine and what's likely to happen for the rest of this year, which, as we will soon see, the West is now estimating maybe the year of Ukraine's defeat. 3 months later after I said it in a recent video that there is no 2025 for Zelensky or Ukraine. So you can see where you can get more up-to-date news. Western media or YouTube. Here's what the BBC has to say in this article. Ukraine could face defeat in 2024. Great reporting by the BBC. Thanks for telling us something that we already know. So it seems the BBC interviewed the former commander of the UK Joint Forces Command, a General Sir Richard Barrons, who says that there is a serious risk of Ukraine losing this war this year. But he says the reason isn't so much because of the lack of ammunition and the lack of manpower. It seems it's more psychological. He says Ukraine may come to feel that it cannot win. That is how he puts it. So that statement there indicates that the West knows already that morale is cratering in Ukraine. The general says that when it gets to that point of low morale, why will Ukrainian people want to fight and die any longer to defend the indefensible? But he says Ukraine is not yet at that point. Now here's something that I've learned following this Ukraine war, especially about Western media reporting. Anytime they say something is difficult on the ground for Ukraine, it's usually about 3 times worse. So when the general says that Ukraine may feel they can't win, it means that is already occurring on the front lines. Western media's only job at this stage, in my opinion, is to keep the Ukrainian morale and hopes high enough to stave off a collapse of the front line, at least until the US elections in November of this year, so that the globalists have a fighting chance to re-elect President Biden. That is their sole goal. Any prospect of military victory for Ukraine has long been a pipe dream. But this General Barron gets down to some more practical assessments here. He says, everyone expects a major Russian offensive this year. The question is, to where and how far? Unlike the Russians, who last year knew exactly where Ukraine was going to launch their counteroffensive in Zaporizhia, to Melitopol, to strike that land bridge and isolate Crimea, Ukraine, on the other hand, has no clue where the Russians are going to attack. And this fact, coupled with their lack of resources, makes them simply unable to defend the entire front line. So the BBC predicts an offensive to Kharkiv, as it is currently being pummeled daily with missile strikes.
This is the aftermath of a Russian ballistic missile attack on a Ukrainian thermal electric plant. The power of these missiles evident in the sheer scale of destruction.
In essence, the BBC is predicting that the Russians will be able to break out of the Donbass in this summer offensive and head towards Ukraine's second largest city in Kharkiv. And if Kharkiv falls, it would be a massive blow, according to the BBC, economically and morale-wise, to the Ukrainian armed forces. Let's go to this section of the article here that talks about the Donbass. Look at the sentence here. Kiev has countered that its resistance has inflicted high casualties on the Russians in the advance on Donetsk. And this is what Kiev has been telling the BBC. And then the BBC, without citing any of these esteemed generals that they were interviewing earlier, they conclude that this is true. It says, the battlefield in these places has been dubbed as the meat grinder. Now let's go on to read another sentence, another quote from this BBC article, from the commander of the US forces in Europe, General Christopher Cavoli, who warned that unless the US rushes significantly more weapons and ammunition to Ukraine, then its forces will be outgunned 10-1. So Christopher Cavoli, in my opinion, is one of the more credible Western commanders. Back in 2022, when we had the likes of General Ben Hodges and David Petraeus talking about the Russian army being on the verge of collapse and these fantastical predictions, this General Cavoli said in a hearing, some sort of state hearing, that he warned that much of the Russian army is not affected by this war.
Your comment about the specificity of the degradation of the Russian forces. Much of the Russian military has not been affected negatively by this conflict. One of those forces is their undersea forces. It's hard to talk in public, as you well know, sir, about undersea warfare and our efforts in that regard. But I can say that the Russians are more active than we've seen them in years, and their patrols into the Atlantic and throughout the Atlantic are at a high level. Most of the time, at a higher level than we've seen in years. And this is, as you pointed out, despite all of the efforts that they're undertaking inside Ukraine.
He spoke about the Navy and the Air Force, which has been largely kept quiet. And he was making the point that the Russian army is nowhere close to collapse because they haven't even brought their full capacity to bear on the battlefield. The second point I want to make is that it absolutely baffles me how the Ukrainians or the West, repeating what the Ukrainians say, could even really logically contemplate Russia taking more casualties than Ukraine at this stage of the war.
Опа! Приседай! Попало? Да! Куда попало? Дай я руку засуну.
When Ukraine is so low on ammunition and manpower and morale, and are facing a Russian army that is growing significantly and far bigger, both in manpower and weapons, than it was at the beginning of the war. Now I want to stay on the Donbass a little bit, and this upcoming siege of this town of Chasiv, which had a population of about 20,000 prior to the Russian invasion. And I'm going to go to El País, which is a Spanish newspaper. Here's an interesting thing they said, which I didn't even realize. They say the mud season in Ukraine seems to not have yet arrived. I had expected that after Avdiivka, the Russian army would pause until the spring rains have completed and the ground hardens in the summer to allow a mechanized advance. But El País says that the Ukrainian current commander-in-chief, General Syrsky, warned of a renewed roll of large number of tanks and other armored vehicles in the Russian offensive because the spring rains that turned the Ukrainian countryside into a quagmire, hampering the movement of tracked heavy armor, has not yet arrived. So, the spring rains haven't come. So maybe it seems that nature has smiled on the Russians, or as the Russians have said in the past, maybe God is for Russia in this war. General Syrsky has seemed to have lost all of his optimism about this war. He says in a matter-of-fact way that the map of the war in Donetsk had significantly deteriorated, and while the situation in the front is always difficult, he said that the Donetsk front is getting harder. So remember what I said, take that assessment and multiply it by 3. And what do you get when you do that? You get the title of the BBC article, Ukraine is facing defeat. Saturday, General Syrsky admitted that Russia took full control of Pervomayorsky, which is about 10 kilometers or 6.2 miles from Avdiivka. Currently, he says, that Russia is advancing on 2 fronts toward Pokrovsk, which is a Ukrainian rear base near southern Donetsk. And listen to this part here. A video circulated of the Russian advance in the sector shows the absence of artillery fire and anti-tank rocket launchers to slow the progress of Russian infantry fighting vehicles. All that Ukraine has is a massive fleet of drones, which Ukrainian Lieutenant Colonel Kurilenko said that the only thing preventing a Russian breakthrough on all fronts is FPV drones, 90% of which is provided not by the US or the Europe or any of the Western allies, but has been provided by volunteers or military divisions themselves. Gentlemen, read between the lines. This thing is over. It is clear that the West has abandoned Ukraine to their fate against a nuclear power to fight or resist an upcoming Russian offensive, which is likely to be the largest scale offensive of this 2022 invasion. They have left poor Ukraine to defend that, mostly with drones that are insufficient to penetrate armored vehicles unless there are multiple successive hits. And these drones aren't even provided by the West. That means to me what I suspected ever since the end of 2023, when US Admiral John Kirby said we have given the last tranche of weapons to Ukraine.
Assistance to Ukraine? I mean, has the well really run dry here, or what does it look like?
We have issued the last drawdown package that we had funding to support, and that's why it's critical that Congress move on that national security supplemental request and we get more funding. The assistance that we provided has now ground to a halt. The attacks that the Russians are conducting are only increasing. And now, as I talked about earlier this week, they're using North Korean ballistic missiles to do their dirty work. So the need is acute right now, particularly in these winter months.
That was it. That was the end of the Western input into this war. And every statement you've heard since about they found how much ever pieces of artillery, or they found the $300 million here.
So today, on behalf of President Biden, I'm announcing an emergency package of security assistance of $300 million worth of weapons and equipment to address some of Ukraine's pressing needs. This is possible because of unanticipated cost savings in contracts that DoD negotiated to replace equipment we've already sent to Ukraine through previous drawdowns.
That is all rhetoric to keep Ukrainian hopes high. There's nothing coming for Ukraine. It is over. Even the ever-hopeful President Zelensky said this, listen to this. He warned the Washington Post that drones cannot replace artillery and anti-aircraft batteries or long-range weaponry. Ukraine, my friends, are learning a very harsh and perhaps fatal lesson about America that Henry Kissinger, I believe, put it aptly. To be an enemy of America is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. They're also learning a very harsh lesson that the West does not consider Ukraine part of their esteemed garden. Remember that quote from Joseph Borrell?
Europe is a garden. We have built a garden. Everything works. It's the best combination of political freedom, economic prosperity, and social cohesion that the humankind has been able to build. There's three things together. And here Bruges is maybe the good representation of beautiful things, intellectual life, well-being. The rest of the world, and you know very well, Federica, is not exactly a garden. The rest of the world, most of the rest of the world is a jungle. And the jungle could invade the garden.
Where he differentiates the garden of Western Europe from the rest of the world, which is a jungle. Well, Ukraine is learning that they form part of that jungle, and the West could not give two hoots about a Ukrainian soldier's life. They have been used as cannon fodder in an attempt to weaken Russia that has failed, and they have been left to their fate with nothing but drones. Zelensky put it this way. He says Ukraine only has 25% of the artillery ammunition they need to resist the Russian advance. Now, even that statistic is curious because I do not know how one can estimate what percentage of artillery is needed to resist a Russian advance that hasn't even yet reached its full strength. It's probably, as I said, 3 times worse. You do the math, that's what, 8%? 8 by 3 is 24. Ukraine probably has 8% of the artillery that they need. So let's go on to Chasiv Yar. Chasiv Yar is important because it sits on an elevated position from which the neighboring town of Konstantinivka will become an easy target for the Russians. And when the Russians take Konstantinivka, it will cut the road linking the southern front of Donetsk with the north, where Ukraine's last line of defense in Kramatorsk and Sloviansk is located. It is also expected that another Russian onslaught will occur to the east from Siversk. So it seems they anticipate a double pincer Russian advance towards the last defense line in Donetsk the Kramatorsk-Sloviansk defense line. But when Russia takes Donetsk, President Putin could take that victory back home and sell it to his Russian people as the success of all goals of the special military operation, because Ukraine will never join NATO, no matter what Jens Stoltenberg tries to tell us. It certainly cannot join NATO while Russia occupies 18 to 20% of its territory, or else NATO will be at war with Russia, and you're not going to get those 31 member states of NATO to agree to that, particularly not Hungary, not Slovakia, and not Turkey. So Ukraine is out of NATO. He would have liberated the Donbass, the Russian-speaking regions. They are now protected when Donetsk is fully Russian. The Ukrainian army is demilitarized. That is what the BBC says. That's what El País says. All those articles say that Ukrainian army is more or less out of artillery, out of air defense, low on manpower, low on morale. They are all but demilitarized. And I believe the West has foreseen this outcome, and they know it's likely to occur this way. And that is why they decided since the end of 2023 to shift focus to fight this war on Israel. And it's a sad fate for Ukraine, but it's one which could have been avoided. Perhaps if Ukraine had a president more like President Putin, instead of a naive actor of Zelensky with no political or military experience, who couldn't understand this geopolitical game and couldn't comprehend that America has no allies and that he is just a pawn. It is only President Putin who was able to foresee decades ago that the West cannot be trusted.
Скажу абсолютно жутко крамольную мысль. Из всех троих задетых в этой истории основательно мира хочет сегодня только...